Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight we're going to be talking about several different topics, and hopefully we'll get to all of them. But of course, we're going to talk about the bombing in Iraq, the Israeli-Hamas situation. I touched on that last week, but I'd like to finish it up this week if I can. And also, we're going to talk about the nationalization of the Federal Reserve and some interesting, well, I guess it's not breaking by the time that this show airs, which is being pre-recorded on August 13th. But some information coming out of Egypt regarding 9/11 and some more information there. So before we get into this, I want to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page, you'll find a chat room, the archives of this show, and an RSS feed link to my articles as they appear on BrandonTurbeville.com. Now, I'm going to remind you also to check out activistpost.com and theantimedia.org, which I write for regularly, both of those websites. And, of course, to go read BrandonTurbeville.com. That's www.BrandonTurbeville.com. And that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all the interviews that I do, and all of the archived versions of this show. Also, that is the website where I have a link to all of my books, and you can buy those books there at the Books tab on the homepage. So, to let you know that the book 5 Cent Solutions has been taken off the market right now. It's being updated, and it will be back out soon enough. But all of the other books are still available there. A little bit of local action. I've been promoting these for the last few weeks, but every Tuesday night in Florence, South Carolina, there will be a weekly health talk, DVD viewing, meeting, etc. over at Health First Chiropractic Center, which is located at 311 West Palmetto Street there in Florence, South Carolina. And if you are passing through, if you're going to be in the South Carolina, North Carolina area, or if you live in that area, then you should make it a point to try to drop in. If you're already familiar with some of the information that they may be discussing, you know, they're going to be talking about vaccines and GMOs and that sort of thing. If you're already familiar with it, that's fine. You should go anyway so you could coordinate with like-minded people, meet like-minded people, and try to put your heads together and see what you can do and build a community there as well. If you're a little unfamiliar with the material regarding GMOs and the dangers of vaccines and those sorts of things, then I'd encourage you to go to the meetings and watch the DVDs and ask some questions and participate in that way. Now, for the show, we're going to get into the Iraq situation first, and this is a very interesting situation because we've got so many complicated aspects to it. We've got the regional alliances, the international alliances, the international interests, the color revolutions, the destabilizations, the balkanizations, the micro-states and mini-states ideas, and of course the proxy war that's taking place between the United States and the Russians over in Ukraine as well. So lots of things playing a part here in Iraq. And we've got the recent announcement of bombing in Iraq by the United States. And I wrote an article the night that it was announced. It was Obama authorizes targeted airstrikes in Iraq, which summed up what was happening in terms of the justifications. I think Obama says that they were going to authorize bombing targeted airstrikes, is what it's being called, if necessary to help forces in Iraq as they fight to break the siege and protect the civilians trapped there. Now, in terms of civilians trapped there, we're talking about the Yazidi Christians in Mount Sinjar, who are trapped on Mount Sinjar. Trapped on Mount Sinjar, of course, because the death squads that are funded by the West, funded by the United States, Britain, France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the relevant networks have surrounded the villages, or at least cornered the village, and told the Christians that they would convert to Islam or have their heads chopped off. The Christians fled up the mountain, Mount Sinjar. Now they're stuck. They're stuck there. No food, no water. And this has been paraded on the television as a human rights crisis. Now, this is one of those rare instances where I have to say that this is a real human rights crisis. Not just something being picked on and promoted to justify bombing. Although in a sense it is. It is being picked on and used to justify bombing. But we'll get to that in a second. There's more to it because this situation is real. There are Yazidi Christians, from what I can tell, who are trapped on Mount Sinjar and who are in danger of losing their lives due to the death squads. But notice that what we have when the bombing took place around Erbil. Now, again, the idea was to protect Iraq against genocide, and specifically these Yazidi Christians. This was what was promoted on the evening news regarding the human rights situation. But there is a little more to this. Again, as I noted, as soon as the bombing began, the bombs fell on Erbil. Now, most Americans would not really question exactly what's happening. In that sense, they assume that we were bombing the death squads to protect the fleeing Christians and the trapped Christians. But if you look at a map of Iraq and you look at Mount Sinjar, where the Christians are trapped, you'll see that it's in the northwest of Iraq. If you look at Erbil, where the bombs fell, Erbil is located in the northeast, or kind of central northeast portion of the country. It's not anywhere near Mount Sinjar. So it's akin to saying we have trapped people in Lincoln, Nebraska, so we bombed Phoenix, Arizona to protect them. It's a massive distance in terms of range. The idea here is that you got to look at what is Erbil, right? Why are they bombing Erbil instead of Mount Sinjar? Now, at August 13th, apparently there have been some salvos which have been fired from military jets at the death squad surrounding Mount Sinjar. Finally, there were humanitarian drops around Mount Sinjar which missed the mountain. It went down the mountain and, of course, probably fell into the hands of the death squads, and they had a nice meal. Some of it fell and exploded upon impact because the parachutes didn't deploy properly. But back to Erbil. What is Erbil, and why did the bombing start in Erbil, all the way over in Erbil? Well, Erbil is the Kurdish region capital of Iraq. And remember that Iraq has essentially been broken up into three countries. There's the Kurdistan, and then there's sort of the Sunni area and the Shiite area. So these are autonomous zones, especially the Kurdish area. It's largely an autonomous zone. They kind of govern themselves, although they are, they do have to defer to the national government. But Erbil is the capital of that area. Erbil is also what has been described as a hub for U.S. oil companies. In fact, Erbil has a population of 1.5 million people. It's largely viewed as the administrative center for the Kurdish regional oil industry. And in fact, the area has about a quarter of Iraq's oil production just in that general area. The oil reserves are so large in this region that Kurds often make the claim that if they were to break off from Iraq as a whole and establish their own country, the new Kurdistan, the new Kurd area, Kurdish country, would be the ninth largest oil producer in the world. So lots of oil in this area. And I think we're starting, you kind of get the idea where I'm going with this, that we're bombing in an area which is seeing threat from the death squads. Keep in mind, the death squads are they're marching on Erbil, and we're bombing them there. I'll explain this in a second. The Islamic State now was marching towards Erbil. If they did that, they would endanger Iraq's oil production and the global access to oil, the U.S.'s access to oil, and NATO's access to oil. Now, of course, we'd see prices surge. We'd also see the inability of NATO to sort of round up a lot of this oil that they fought for to begin with. Now, we had reports shortly after, or I'm sorry, shortly before the bombing took place in Erbil by the United States, that we had American oil companies like Chevron and ExxonMobil were evacuating their personnel from the Kurdistan region. And we also had reports, we had some other oil companies, some British oil companies were pulling out as well. Genel Energy was one of them. They were pulling staff from the fields that had not started production yet, and there were some fields at Tak Tak and Taka. So they were considered secure. So we have this situation here where the death squads are threatening oil production in the Kurdistan regions, and then suddenly the United States, which allowed ISIS to take over large swaths of territory in Iraq, which we don't seem to be doing anything about, because that's not the issue. The issue is, of course, to get Maliki out. To get Maliki out to break the Iraq-Iran-Syria alliance, and probably we could add Lebanon into that as well. But the goal was to get Maliki out of there, to put pressure on Maliki, to destabilize the country and get rid of Maliki. And that's what's largely happened. Maliki has been removed by the president, I believe. And, of course, Maliki is claiming that the president and the parliament removed him unconstitutionally, and it does appear that they did this. So there's some question now about who should Maliki step down. Was this the democratic process? It does appear that it was not. And Maliki, whatever his faults, was obviously superior to ISIS, but is also superior to the U.S. puppet that was positioned to take over. And this new individual, we don't know much about him, who's going to take Maliki's place if that actually happens. But it appears that he is somewhat more Anglo-friendly than Maliki was. And of course, Maliki was not Anglo, anti-Anglo. Maliki was simply working on the alliance with these other Shiite countries and with Syria and with Lebanon, through Syria, I guess we should say, but particularly with Iran and Syria. And this had to be stopped because the Arab bloc was not going to be allowed to develop. But essentially, again, I can't stress this enough, you're bombing Erbil not to stop the death squads, because the death squads are in fact under control of the West and the Saudi Arabians and the Israelis and so forth. They're simply bombing the death squads to protect the oil production in Erbil. Now, we should move over to Egypt now, where a very interesting thing took place, and that is the trial of Habib al-Adli. Right? This was the ex-minister of the Interior during Mubarak's government. He was arrested after the 2011 Arab Spring. He was thrown out. He was arrested, and he's being tried. Now he's being retried in Egypt under the Sisi government. And we have an interesting transcript. Okay, basically you can find this on The Guardian, I believe, which is the original. Let me see if I can pull this up so you can get a better idea of what I'm trying to give it out to you here. It's actually not on The Guardian. It's on Ahram Online. This was the article entitled "Mubarak's Interior Minister Says U.S. Orchestrated 2011 Revolution." Now, this is something that the listeners of this show are going to know from listening for some time. But essentially, on Saturday, and this is the Saturday before August 13th, al-Adli was being charged, and he was giving a sort of a testimony to the court, and he stated that the United States was behind the 2011 revolution against Mubarak. Right? This is not something that we don't know. We know that the United States was behind the Arab Spring, but this is what he says. It should be noted that his trial surrounds the fact that he is being accused of, along with 6 of his aides, as well as Mubarak himself and Mubarak's 2 sons, of killing protesters during the 2011 uprising. Now, El Adly, during the speech to the criminal court where he's being retried, said the U.S. had 2 parts to the plan. And the first part was to approach the leaders of the Middle East with a democratic model and finance incentives to adopt that model. And if the leaders did not accept, if they refused, then the U.S. would accuse them of being dictators. Now that part is what we saw. In other words, what he's saying is that the United States told these leaders to do something, and if you don't do it, we will accuse you of being dictators. That's what they did. There was the second part, according to El Adly, and he said this was mobilizing youth in these countries and teaching them how to demand their rights, demand democracy, and how to revolt against existing regimes. Well, that's exactly what happened. This is the description of a color revolution. Now, El Adly went on and he said the U.S. trained young people in Egypt, opposition groups like Kefaya and the April 6th youth movement, which was, of course, the Arab Spring. It was involved. The Muslim Brotherhood was involved in this as well, and it was the classic textbook color revolution, and of course, this has been revealed by history. So, all right, we also have the El Adly saying that on January 25th, 2011, the first day of the massive protest that led to Mubarak's ouster, that police only used water hoses and tear gas, but in Suez, he says, protesters turned the place into hell. He says they were torching police stations, letting foreign elements to the country on January 27th. And he said the foreign elements reached Cairo on January 28th. Now, who is he talking about with foreign elements? He's talking about terrorists and Muslim Brotherhood operatives. Now, he says that the Interior Ministry had tapped phone conversations within Egypt, and he admits to that, but he also said Egyptian security intelligence, all these institutions did the same thing. Of course, the United States, if we're going to pass judgment on that, that would be hypocritical at the utmost degree. But he says that Egyptian police had given some of their weapons to Palestinian police, who had then used these weapons to kill Egyptian protesters and framed the Egyptian police. In other words, he's claiming that someone within the Egyptian police had given weapons to Palestinian police, who then used those weapons to kill the protesters and say that the Egyptian police did it. Now, we don't know about that, but we do know that we had numerous instances of violence against the police. We also know that during the youth movement, April 6th youth movement, that the police did stand down on a lot of occasions for the protesters and didn't crack down, simply because Mubarak was a dictator, and there's no denying that Mubarak was a horrible, corrupt dictator. But of course what they brought in was Morsi, a Muslim Brotherhood fanatic who wanted to commit the country to war and implement austerity programs and bring about this stupid, Islamic political Islam, essentially. And we know that was an extremely violent movement on the part of the so-called protesters. But this is only the first important statement made by El Adly, because he made something even more profound, but conveniently, this didn't make the media. Where are the reports coming from CNN, who was so interested in Egypt? Where are the reports from Democracy Now? I guess we'll call them Hypocrisy Now. Where are those reports? Where are the reports from Fox? Well, we don't get any reports because El Adly had something else interesting to say about 9/11. And essentially, this is what El Adly has to say, and we'll read this. And keep in mind, this is not a professional translation. This is this is a very rough translation. This is what he says. In May 2001, we received information that a very huge terrorist attack will happen in the USA. How? The source of the information was inside the lair of Al-Qaeda, and we verified it. There were preparations for the attack. I talked to the president, which is Mubarak, and I told him that I have information that a huge terrorist attack will happen in the USA, and I asked him if we should tell them. He said, okay. We contacted the CIA and FBI and told them about the information. They said thanks. On August of the same year, we received the information that the operation entered its course of implementation and is entering its final steps. An operation like this takes time, preparation and arrangements, and etc. This conversation was recorded between us and the source. I called the president and told him the information is confirmed. Should we tell them? He said, tell them. We called the people in the USA and told them that the operation entered the course of implementation. They said okay and thanks. Then the attack on the World Trade Center happened. This was the operation. Do you see how cooperative we were? This is why I'm furious and enraged. I cooperated with them, and in return they hit my organization and destroyed and ruined the country of Egypt. He goes on, he says, President Mubarak traveled to America in 2002. When there, he told President Bush, we told you about this attack, and you didn't pay attention. He said, what attack? And how? Bush denied that they had heard about that, and Mubarak insisted that they did. Mubarak called me to confirm that we informed them about the information. He asked me, who did I tell? I said the CIA people. He said okay and told Bush. It seems the CIA people told Bush that they didn't receive any news, and Mubarak told him, no, we informed you this and that. And they said, oh, yes, it happened, but it was only told verbally. What verbally? It seems as if they wanted to receive some written memo. We received the news, blah, 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 what happened. Now, that is the statement made by Habib al-Adli, former Interior Minister to Mubarak. In other words, they had information that a terrorist attack was being planned against the United States, and it was in its final stages of implementation. So they warned the United States not once but twice. There were terror attacks imminent for the United States. They warned them before September the 11th, and the United States did nothing. They ignored it, and then they covered it up when it was reported. So conveniently, that information made it nowhere near the mainstream media here in the United States. So we gotta wonder why. Right? Of course, I say that facetiously because we don't have to wonder why. We know exactly why. Now, I guess we can get into part of this before we go to the break and then tie it all up in the second half. And this is the question of Israel and Hamas. I've been through this somewhat on this show before, the question, the nature of Hamas, but I think we should go into a little bit more detail in terms of who created the organization, what purpose it serves, and who's behind this. So, I've got an article out entitled, Why Aren't ISIS and Al-Qaeda Attacking Israel? And in this article I go through the history of Hamas and who created it. And the creator is largely Israel. Now, I also did an article a while back that summed up an interview that was done by Nabil Naim. And Naim was a former Al-Qaeda commander who gave an interview to Al Madin, which is an Arabic news station. And he stated that he had quit Al-Qaeda, and he was saying that he was quitting the organizations, and all these organizations were controlled by the CIA. And he brings up the question of Issam Hatito, who was the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was responsible for leading some of the battles against Assad in Syria. And Naim says, where does Hatito reside? Is he in Beirut? Is he in Riyadh? Is he in Cairo? No, he's in Tel Aviv. Then he brings up Ahmed Jarba, right? He says, does he live in Riyadh, Cairo? Does he live in Tehran? No, he's going between New York, Paris, and London. His employers who pay his expenses. And of course, he was right to point this out, because that's exactly the case. They are indeed controlled, the terrorist organizations are indeed controlled by the West, by Israel, and by NATO, by the Anglo-Americans, the Anglo-Europeans, or whatever you want to call them. This has become difficult to give it a name. The New World Order, I guess, if you want to be very general, but essentially NATO, the United States, and and Mossad involved as well. But the fact is that it's not just Al-Qaeda and all these organizations. We also have organizations like Hamas. right? And the fact is that Hamas was created by Israel. In fact, Israel is well known for its support of jihadist terrorists in places like Syria. And in fact, in this article, I go through some of this information, and we have clear documented evidence of the Israelis providing medical assistance to the terrorists in Syria. For instance, we have an article by Colin Lynch of The Cable, which is the news wing of the Council on Foreign Relations Foreign Policy magazine, where he documents how in the 3 months or so there were a number of Syrian death squad fighters who were transported, and this is not this past 3 months, this was back in February, I believe, or maybe a few months around, was one of the months surrounding that. But back then there were Syrian death squad fighters who were being brought across the border, across the ceasefire line, back into Israel, and given medical treatment, where they were then sent back to Syria to continue to fight against Assad. And we had this information coming from United Nations soldiers who had seen the fact that they were transferring wounded Syrian death squads over to Israel to be treated and then transferred back to Syria. We've known that this, if I don't say we say we know, we've known for some time, but in the article by Colin Lynch, the writer even mentions the fact that Lynch mentions the fact that the medical assistance to the death squads have been provided as far back as February of this year, 2014. In fact, in February of 2014, we saw Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, actually going to the medical facilities where these individuals were being treated and posing for photo ops, shaking hands with the death squad fighters. So that's one aspect of it. And of course, they've provided military support, bombing campaign support, and so forth for the death squad fighters. And this is well known as well. We'll get into some of that, and we'll get into the history of Hamas in the next segment. So ladies and gentlemen, please stay with us. This is Truth on the Tracks. Again, Monday night and Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. Just stay with us through this break, and we'll be right back on the other side.
September 1997, Khalid Mashal was hours, perhaps minutes away from dying. He'd been walking on the streets of Amman, Jordan, when two men, later reported to be agents of Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad, injected or sprayed him with poison.
I heard a loud noise in my ear. It felt like an electric shock.
The Israeli agents were captured. Jordan's king reportedly threatened to put them on trial if the Israeli government didn't provide an antidote. The White House even intervened. President Bill Clinton, trying to keep peace between Jordan and Israel, pressured Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to provide the antidote. Netanyahu, widely reported to have ordered the hit on Mashal in retaliation for suicide attacks in Israel, relented. Mashal was revived.
Once he survived this attack, this leader, who was previously relatively unknown, became very popular. His stature goes straight to the top. He's the living martyr.
Mashal is now the leader of the Hamas movement. He recently spoke to CBS News.
We are not fanatics. We are not fundamentalists.
But one Israeli official calls the 58-year-old former teacher the Osama bin Laden of Hamas. Analysts say he's an inspirational commander for attacks and a deal maker, securing status and money for Hamas from his home in Qatar.
That is the ATM of Hamas right now. The Qataris provide significant funding to Hamas, and Khalid Mashal is the point man for that.
The Qataris deny that.
Qatar does not support Hamas.
It's not clear how much control Mashal has over the military wing of Hamas, which launches the attacks on Israel. And street cred is an issue for Khalid Mashal. He's reportedly been to Gaza only once, and the Israelis themselves may be trying to undermine Mishal's standing within Hamas, painting him as an insulated, pampered jihadist.
This guy, Khalid Mashal, he's roaming around five-star hotel suites in the Gulf states, having the time of his life while he's deliberately putting his people as fodder for this horrible terrorist war that they're conducting against us.
Analysts say Mashal wants to eventually become leader of all the Palestinians. But will he? The U.S. has designated Mashal a terrorist. The Americans and Europeans would have a tough time recognizing his legitimacy, and his survivability is in question. There are a lot of rivalries within Hamas, and when I asked if the Israelis might target Khalid Mashal again, an Israeli official said, no comment.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Just like to remind you to catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. Now, before the break, we were discussing the Israeli involvement with terror on our way to discuss Hamas, but let's stay on the Syrian death squad funding and direction for just a second. I mentioned before the break how Israel was providing medical assistance to the death squads in Syria. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, had actually staged a photo op shaking hands with some of the death squads in Israel, or being patched up to go back off to war to fight against Assad. But we also have the situation where Israel is acting as the military support wing for these death squads in the form of artillery and Air Force bombing campaigns. Now, these attacks launched by Israel into Syria, because we have numerous situations and occasions where Israel has bombed Syria over the last few years, but these attacks generally come after the Assad government seems to be making considerable gains on the ground against the death squad fighters. One of those incidents, for instance, October 30th, 2013, we had Israel attacking and completely destroying a Syrian air defense base in Snobar Jabla in Syria. That's located over there near Latakia, the port on the coast of the Mediterranean. And this base was alleged to have housed a surface-to-air missile battery, and it was destroyed by Israel. We also have, in terms of the bombing, we've had Israel bomb Syria at least 4 times prior to the October 30th attack that I just mentioned. In fact, as recently as June 2014, we had Israel launch a series of airstrikes against Syria and against Syrian military positions under the pretext of retaliation for a cross-border attack, which was most certainly initiated by the death squads. Right? Essentially what happened was that an Israeli teenager was killed, and the blame was placed on the Syrian government, but it turned out very quickly that it was not the Syrian government, it was death squads. And, essentially what happened was that this teenager, an Israeli teenager, was killed by an anti-tank missile, of which the death squads had. But Israel has this policy, obviously designed to do what it's doing, which is it doesn't matter if the Syrian military or the death squad fighters cross the border into Israel. Syria, Assad, will be held responsible. So what apparently happened was that the death squads crossed over into Israel, these mental deficients that can't even tell the borders, they can't even help biting the hands that feed them, crossed the border and probably killed this Israeli teenager, if it happened at all, to be honest. We've had a slew of Israeli teenagers being murdered in the recent months, and as I said last week, it must be a very bad time to be an Israeli teenager, because they're dropping like flies everywhere at the most convenient occasions and times. But not just the isolated attacks, of which there have been several, but there have been actual attempts at providing cover fire and diversions for the death squads and the jihadist invasions and the swarming techniques. We have in May 2013, there was an article that came out by Aaron Klein that was discussing what had happened in Syria, where Israel apparently coordinated with Turkey, which itself helped coordinate the death squads to time an attack to occur at the same time as Israeli airstrikes. In other words, death squads had crossed the border from Turkey and swarmed into Syria, but at the same time that this was happening, the Israelis were launching an airstrike. And in fact, Klein even brought it up that Israel's airstrike in Syria was coordinated with Turkey, and which coordinated the rebel attacks to coincide with the Israeli strike, right? And this was from Egyptian and Jordanian intelligence sources that this came out, but it's also common sense. So you got to look at the timelines. All you got to look at. So we had the Klein article quoting Egyptian intelligence saying that almost the moment the Israel Air Force departed was the moment when the rebel advance began. So there's that. Klein also writes, he says, the Egyptian and Jordanian sources described how immediately after today's Israeli airstrike, the jihadist rebels used access roads to advance toward Damascus and began heavy clashes with Syrian military forces throughout the country. So that's end quote. But we've also got this video evidence back in 2011 coming from a terrorist training camp, this mercenary terrorist training camp inside Israel, which was being tailor-made to be used in the Arab world. In fact, the Israeli establishment doesn't even really attempt to hide its support for these terrorists anymore, because we had a report in 2011 coming from the Media Line, which is an international news organization which tends to focus on the Middle East, by an individual named Uriah O'Sullivan, who he was able to actually film the training camp. He got interviews, he got on-screen narration, he got plenty of video footage of actual training taking place. So there's a multicultural group of men there. There were Arabs, Africans, Europeans, all of them dressed in Arab clothing, riding camels, taking part in tactical training, and all that's available. I'll link to it in my article. It's all available to look at on YouTube. And the training camp was run by International Security Academy Israel, which is training these activists. I apologize, I'm having some technical difficulties here. But the background of these fighters, these trainees, are pretty diverse, right? They come from ex-military officers, police, French legionnaires were even there at this training camp, and again, they even interviewed some of the mercenaries who were being trained there. They had some from Singapore. In fact, the narrator at the end of this report says it's an expensive program costing upwards of 2,000 euros a week, but it's a lucrative profession, earning thousands of euros a day. So there's that. There are also allusions to the Arab Spring in that report as well. Now, we know that Israel, and we're going to get to Hamas now, but we know that Israel has been somewhat known for creating fake Al-Qaeda groups to justify its treatment of the Palestinians. But when we talk about Hamas, and this is something that's not clearly understood by most people, but we talk about Hamas, which is supposedly Israel's arch nemesis, right? But what most people don't understand is that Israel actually created Hamas, and they did that for the purpose of splitting the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So they wanted to split the PLO and Fatah, which was the leading outfit of the PLO, which itself was the leading Palestinian freedom and resistance movement. Now, we had a situation earlier on where, again, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know if you can hear what I'm hearing on my end. It certainly Hope you don't, but I apologize for the delays here. We have a report coming from The Nation, written by Robert Dreyfuss, and he involves he discusses the decades before 9/11, where the United States and Israel, of course, used Muslim fundamentalists on what they call the far right, whether they're talking about the ability to destroy secular nationalists such as Nasser in Egypt or Mossadegh in Iran. But we also have Israel, the United States, Jordan, and a number of other countries, NATO countries, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and a bunch of other crazy death squad organizations in Syria. But in Israel, we had Israel backing Ahmed Yassin and the Muslim Brotherhood in the West Bank and Gaza, which led directly to Hamas. Now, there's an excellent report by Justin Raimondo of antiwar.com, who wrote his article, Hamas, Son of Israel, back in 2006. And I would encourage people to pick that article up. It's online and available, so you can read it. And what he talks about, and of course he throws this all in terms of blowback, like it was just a big mistake, that they created Hamas and it was a tragic mistake. But unfortunately, that's not the case. That's leaving things up to incompetence and coincidence yet again, which is a cop out, unfortunately. But Raimondo still writes a great article here, and we have several current and former U.S. intelligence officials, beginning in the late 1970s, giving us reports about this, but that Tel Aviv, that Israel gave direct and indirect financial aid to Hamas over a period of a number of years, that it did this directly. It wanted to use Hamas as a counterbalance to the PLO. And some of this comes from Tony Kordsman, the Middle East analyst for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it was essentially an attempt to divide and dilute the support for the secular PLO, and by doing that, by using a competing religious alternative. Now, we've also got a Middle Eastern analyst, Ray Hanania, who concurs about this situation. He says that the creation of Hamas was an attempt to lure the Palestinian masses away from Arafat and the PLO, and that this was concocted under the Likud leadership of Israel, and said that they did this in the knowledge that they could create what he called a workable alliance with Islamic anti-Arafat forces that would also extend Israel's control over the occupied territories, end quote. So, 1978, we had Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who actually approved the application of Sheikh Ahmad Yassin to start what he called a humanitarian organization known as the Islamic Association, or Mujama. The roots of that group, the Mujama, the Islamic Association, the roots of that group were in the Muslim Brotherhood, and this eventually grew into Hamas. But it was fertilized and nurtured with Israeli funding and political support. So this was created from the get-go. Hamas was created from the get-go by the Israelis. Now, it's important that we note here that the Muslim Brotherhood and being supported and connected to intelligence agencies is nothing new. Just it's connected to the Mossad, of course, and other forms of Israeli intelligence. But the Muslim Brotherhood is also connected closely and historically to Western intelligence, most notably the British and the American versions of those intelligence agencies. So we had Menachem Begin, the former Prime Minister of Israel, and his successor Yitzhak Shamir. Both of these individuals launched a conclusive effort to undercut the PLO by creating what is called the Village Leagues, and this was basically a group of local councils of Palestinians who were handpicked to collaborate with Israel, and they knew they would collaborate with Israel because Israel paid them to do it. So Sheikh Yassin and his little clique and groups became a force within the Village Leagues, and there was this tactical alliance between Yassin and the Israelis using the village leagues and the Mujama, the Islamic Association. Right, so all this was kind of merged together. The Israelis allowed Yassin's group to publish a newspaper. They allowed them to set up, and this is really important here, but an extensive network of charitable organizations. Now, what is that? This is the comparable. The comparable state of NGOs, non-governmental organizations and foundations and charities and so forth that we have here in the United States and all across the world, where you have this color revolution, this constant color revolution, destabilization mechanism that exists, and destabilization mechanism, as I said. So this is what it is. So you've got these charitable organizations. They collected funds, of course, from funds from the Israelis. The Israelis paid these charitable organizations, gave them money, but also Arab states that opposed Arafat. There's a number of Arab states that opposed Arafat as well. So they essentially were able to turn the University of Gaza into a base which was used to recruit activists for Hamas, and turn these individuals into not just activists but fighters and suicide bombers and so forth. And it was essentially the only higher education institution in the Gaza Strip, and it was the only one open to Palestinians since Anwar Sadat actually closed Egyptian colleges to Palestinians. When there was a conflict which arose over religious issues, this is key in terms of the promotion of Hamas, right? The Israeli authorities sided with the Islamists against the secularists of Fatah and PLO. We have instances where Israeli authorities completely dismissed their opponents in the committee in February 1981, which resulted in how would we say this? Islamization of policy here in the Islamic University of Gaza, and in fact the IUG, the Islamic University in Gaza, included an obligation for women to wear the hijab and created separate entrances for men and women. Again, this was something foreign to Palestine. This is not how Palestinians lived. In fact, go back and listen to my interview with Dr. Gabriel Batarse, and he'll tell you how they lived. They didn't wear the hijab and stupid stuff like this. They, but anyway, we'll get back to this. The Israeli authorities essentially promoted this in the Gazan University. The Israeli authorities allowed the Mujama to keep weapons caches to use against, not Israel by the way, but against secularists, against Fatah, against the PLO. So by the mid-1980s, it was the largest university in the occupied territories with 4,500 students, and student elections were won by the Mujama. So you get this situation where just even in the Islamic University, even in Gaza, the university was taken over by this Israeli-promoted Hamas and Mujama that used that university as a grist mill for activists and terrorists and Islamic extremists. That's really the key. So the motive was to offset Arafat's influence, to divide the Palestinians, and what, as I said, Raimondo and antiwar.com would argue is that this was blowback, this was a tragic mistake. But this isn't a tragic mistake. It's a wonderfully laid out plan that's worked very well. So we also have another article that's really good, and it's published in the Wall Street Journal, believe it or not, and it's entitled "How Israel Helped to Spawn Hamas" by Andrew Higgins. And we have this quote by Mr. Cohen, who is a Tunisian-born Jew who worked in Gaza for about 20 years. And he says, Hamas, to my regret, is Israel's creation. Now, he watched the Islamist movement grow and form and take shape, and he watched it develop alongside the secular Palestinian groups, and then kind of change and develop into what is today considered Hamas. So let me read you part of this quote from the Wall Street Journal article. It says, instead of trying to curb Gaza's Islamists from the outset, says Mr. Cohen, Israel for years tolerated and in some cases encouraged them as a counterweight to the secular nationalists of the Palestine Liberation Organization and its dominant faction, Yasser Arafat's Fatah. Israel cooperated with a crippled, half-blind cleric named Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, even as he was laying the foundations for what would become Hamas. Sheikh Yassin continues to inspire militants today. During the recent war in Gaza, Hamas fighters confronted Israeli troops with Yassins, primitive rocket-propelled grenades named in honor of the cleric. So all of this listed here in the article. Now it says, let me go back to the article. I want to read a few quotes from here because it's got some pretty important topics. It's got some pretty important quotes. Here's another quote. It says, when Israel first encountered Islamists in Gaza in the 1970s and 80s, they seemed focused on studying the Quran, not on confrontation with Israel. The Israeli government officially recognized a precursor to Hamas called Mujama al-Islamiyah, registering the group as a charity. It allowed Mujama members to set up an Islamic university and build mosques, clubs, and schools. Crucially, Israel often stood aside when the Islamists and their secular left-wing Palestinian rivals battled, sometimes violently, for influence in both Gaza and the West Bank. It goes on, it says, when it became clear in the early 1990s that Gaza's Islamists had mutated from a religious group into a fighting force aimed at Israel, particularly after they turned to suicide bombings in 1994, Israel cracked down with ferocious force. But each military assault only increased Hamas's appeal to ordinary Palestinians. The group ultimately trounced secular rivals, notably Fatah, in a 2006 election supported by Israel's main ally, the U.S. So in other words, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They organize, develop, and promote the Islamic extremist organization. They use it to divide the PLO and destabilize the PLO. And once it does that, every time Israel invades Gaza or the West Bank, it only grows in appeal, right? Because you've got the secularists who are not extremists, who are armed to the teeth and engaging in terrorist attacks. Hamas appears as the only thing willing to fight back. It's the only thing that people have got, in other words. So their appeal grows even more and more, despite the fact that they kind of, they essentially work for Israel. The average person doesn't really know this, and the average person, of course, sees Hamas as the only group standing up physically for the Palestinians, and they're drawn to the group. So let's go back to the article, the time we have left. In Gaza, Israel hunted down members of Fatah and other secular PLO factions, but it dropped harsh restrictions imposed on Islamic activists by the territory's previous Egyptian rulers. We'll go to another section. The Muslim Brotherhood, led in Gaza by Sheikh Yassin, was free to spread its message openly. In addition to launching various charity projects, Sheikh Yassin collected money to reprint the writings of Saeed Qutb, an Egyptian member of the Brotherhood who, before his execution by President Nasser, advocated global jihad. He is now seen as one of the founding ideologues of militant political Islam. Now, of course, militant political Islam goes back much further than that. Militant political Islam was used by the British under Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, to divide the Arabian countries way back then. Back to the article. Mr. Cohen, who worked at the time for the Israeli government's Religious Affairs Department in Gaza, says he began to hear disturbing reports in the mid-1970s about Sheikh Yassin from traditional Islamic clerics. He says they warned that the Sheikh had no formal Islamic training and was ultimately more interested in politics than faith. They said, keep away from Yassin, he is a big danger, recalls Mr. Cohen. Instead, Israel's military-led administration in Gaza looked favorably on the paraplegic cleric who set up a wide network of schools, clinics, a library, and kindergartens. Because who's going to attack a school, clinic, library, and kindergarten besides Israel, of course? Who's going to attack that publicly? You know, just in terms of calling them out for what they are. Sheikh Yassin formed the Islamic group Mujama al-Islamiyah, which was officially recognized by Israel as a charity and then, in 1979, as an association. Israel also endorsed the establishment of the Islamic University of Gaza, which now it regards as a hotbed of militancy, which it created. Here's another section. General Yitzhak Shejev, who took over as governor in Gaza in late 1979, says he had no illusions about Sheikh Yassin's long-term intentions or the perils of political Islam. As Israel's former military attaché in Iran, he watched Islamic fervor topple the Shah. However, in Gaza, says Mr. Shejev, our main enemy was Fatah, and the cleric was still 100% peaceful towards Israel. Of course, he was going to remain that way, of course, right? Former officials say Israel was also at the time wary of being viewed as an enemy of Islam. Bull. Bull, bull, bull. Israel's never cared about being seen as an enemy of Islam. Israel is an enemy of Islam. It's an enemy of world peace. Mr. Shejev said he had regular contact with Sheikh Yassin, in part to keep an eye on him. He visited his mosque and met the cleric around a dozen times. It was illegal at the time for Israelis to meet anyone from the PLO. Mr. Shejev later arranged for the cleric to be taken to Israel for hospital treatment. So this extremist cleric was taken to Israel for hospital treatment. There we see that again. We had no problems with him, Mr. Shejev says. In fact, the cleric and Israel had a shared enemy, secular Palestinian activists. After a failed attempt in Gaza to oust secularists from leadership of the Palestinian Red Crescent, the Muslim version of the Red Cross, Mujama staged a violent demonstration, storming the Red Crescent building. Islamists also attacked shops selling liquor and cinemas. The Israeli military mostly stood on the sidelines. This is what Hamas is. They are extremists. In fact, note that Hamas supports the death squads in Syria. They support the death squads in Syria. And in fact, Hamas does have ties to terrorist organizations, death squads running rampant in Sinai, near Egypt, which is why Egypt is not favorable to the Palestinian cause, because Egypt constantly has to deal with the terrorists aligned with Hamas in the Sinai. So Hamas is not a good organization. We got to bear that in mind, and we got to bear in mind who created them and for what purpose. Let me try to squeeze in one more long quote from this article before the end of the hour. See if I can do this in a minute. A leader of Brzezinski's Islamist faction at the time was Mahmoud Musleh, now a pro-Hamas member of a Palestinian legislature elected in 2006. He recalls how usually aggressive Israeli security forces stood back and let conflagration develop. He denies any collusion between his own camp and the Israelis, but says they hoped we would become an alternative to the PLO. A year later, in 1984, the Israeli military received a tip-off from Fatah supporters that Sheikh Yassin's Gaza Islamists were collecting arms, according to Israeli officials in Gaza at the time. Israeli troops raided a mosque and found a cache of weapons. Sheikh Yassin was jailed. He told Israeli interrogators the weapons were for use against rival Palestinians, not Israel, according to Mr. Hakam, the military affairs expert who says he spoke frequently with jailed Islamists. The cleric was released after a year and continued to expand Mujama's reach across Gaza. So essentially, this is the history of Hamas, ladies and gentlemen. Bear no illusions about the nature of this organization. Bear no illusions about the nature of Israel, who created it, in concert, of course, with the United States and NATO countries, and of course, this is connected to the expansion of Islamic terror across Iraq and Syria and Libya and the world destabilization campaigns. And we'll have to get more into this next time. Of course, next week, if I can, I'll talk about the nationalization of the Federal Reserve. I've been mentioning that for the last 2 weeks. I want to get into detail on that. So, ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. Monday night, Friday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.